For 20 years my wife went to the neighbor's house every Friday night. That sentence has lived quietly in the back of my mind for 2 decades. Never spoken out loud, never challenged, never truly examined. Every Friday, just after sunset, she would put on her coat, say she'd be late, and step out the door with the same calm certainty. I never stopped her. I never questioned her. I told myself that trust was what held a marriage together, and suspicion was what tore it apart. But trust, I've learned, can also blind a man. Our house would fall into a deep stillness after she left. The clock would tick louder than usual. The walls would seem farther apart. I'd sit in my chair, staring at the door she'd closed behind her, convincing myself that routine meant safety. That consistency meant honesty. That 20 years of repetition couldn't possibly hide something dangerous. Until the night my hands started shaking for no clear reason. It was a quiet Friday, colder than usual. She moved around the house preparing to leave, her movements efficient, practiced. There was nothing rushed, nothing nervous. That almost bothered me more. When she kissed my cheek, it felt normal, warm, familiar, and yet something inside me tightened, like a warning I had ignored for too long. After the door closed, I didn't sit down. I walked through the house instead, slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the counter, grounding myself in familiar things. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I didn't know why not yet. But a thought I had buried for years suddenly surfaced, sharp and unavoidable. What happens in a place you're never allowed to see? The neighbor's house sat just across the street. Same lights every Friday. Same porch glow. Same closed curtains. For 20 years, I never once stepped inside. Never asked what went on there. Never wondered why it had to be every Friday, without fail. That night, something broke in me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was a quiet fracture, the kind that spreads slowly until the whole structure collapses. I told myself I needed answers. Not accusations. Not assumptions. Just the truth. That's when I made a decision I never imagined I'd make in my life. I didn't confront her. I didn't follow her. I prepared. The next week, my hands moved with a steadiness that surprised me. I told myself this was temporary. Just enough to settle my mind. Just enough to prove that my doubts were foolish. I didn't think about the line I was crossing. I didn't think about consequences. I thought only about clarity. When Friday came again, everything unfolded as usual. Same time, same words. Same door closing softly behind her. But this time, when I sat down, I wasn't alone with my thoughts. I waited. Minutes passed slowly. Then hours. I watched the screen in front of me, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. My breathing grew shallow as the recordings began to play back in fragments, movement, muffled sounds. Shifting light. What I saw at first made no sense. What I heard made even less. And as the night wore on, as each moment stacked onto the next, a realization crept in so heavy it felt like it pressed down on my chest. Life I thought I knew, the marriage I believed I understood wasn't just hiding something from me. It was built on something I was never meant to discover. And once the recordings finished, I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. My world would never be the same again. Didn't tell myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself I was doing the necessary thing. There's a difference, and I felt it deeply as the days passed between Fridays. For 20 years, routine had been my excuse. Now, awareness became my burden. I started noticing details I had ignored for most of my marriage. Not dramatic things. Small ones. The way she folded laundry more carefully on Fridays. The way she avoided eye contact an hour before leaving. The way she became lighter afterward, almost relieved. As if something heavy had been set down somewhere else. All those years, I had mistaken familiarity for honesty. The second Friday after I installed the device, My nerves were already worn thin before sunset. I watched the clock like it was counting down to something irreversible. When she moved through the house that evening, I could feel my chest tighten with every step she took. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't distracted. She was prepared. That frightened me more than any sign of guilt would have. She left exactly on time. I didn't follow. I didn't stand at the window. I sat down slowly, as if sudden movement might break something fragile inside me. The room felt colder, quieter. When I finally turned on the screen, my hands were steady in a way they hadn't been for years. That scared me too. The recording began. The first few minutes were ordinary. Footsteps, the sound of the night air, the familiar street. Then the door across the road opened, and the atmosphere changed. Not abruptly, gradually. The sounds shifted. Voices overlapped. Movements slowed and became deliberate. This wasn't a casual visit. This was entry into a space governed by its own rules. I realized I was holding my breath. The recordings captured things I never expected to recognize: patterns of speech, subtle cues, pauses that meant more than words. People reacted to her presence as if she belonged there. Not as a guest. Not as an interruption. As someone whose arrival completed something that had already begun. The worst part was the calm. There was no chaos. No panic. No secrecy in the frantic sense. Everything unfolded smoothly, like a process that had been refined over years. My wife moved through that space with confidence, purpose, authority. I had never seen that side of her in our home. I rewound parts of the footage. Watched them again, slower, carefully. I began to notice repetition, not just week to week, but within the same night. The same phrases spoken at the same moments. The same positions taken in the room. The same pauses before certain actions. It was ritualistic, structured, planned. I stopped the recording halfway through and stood up, my legs weak. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stared at my reflection in the dark window. The man looking back at me seemed smaller somehow. Not physically, existentially, as if the life I thought I occupied was only a fraction of the truth. When I sat down again, I forced myself to keep watching. The longer the recording played, the clearer one thing became. This wasn't about emotion. It wasn't about desire or escape or loneliness. Whatever was happening in that house had intent behind it. There were moments where she listened more than she spoke. Moments where others deferred to her. Moments where decisions were made quietly, efficiently, without discussion. I realized then that I hadn't just underestimated her. I had never known her at all. When the recording ended, I felt no relief. Only weight. A slow, crushing understanding that 20 years of my life had run parallel to something I had never been invited into. And the most painful truth wasn't that she had gone there every Friday. It was that she had never once hesitated. Not for my questions. Not for my presence. Not for my trust. I shut off the screen and sat in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. The walls felt unfamiliar, like I was living inside a version of my life that had been staged for my comfort. I understood then that confrontation would be useless. Anger would only make me blind again. If I wanted the truth, I would have to earn it the way she had earned hers, with patience, with silence, with observation, because whatever waited at the end of this discovery wasn't going to reveal itself easily, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that the recordings I had already seen were only the surface. The real truth was still buried, and it was watching me now just as closely as I was watching it. By the third Friday, fear had changed shape. It was no longer sharp or frantic. It had settled into something heavier, like a weight I carried in my chest every hour of the day. I moved through the house differently now, quieter, more deliberate, as if the walls themselves were listening. I watched my wife with a new kind of attention, not suspicion exactly, but awareness. Every glance, every pause, Every breath felt loaded with meaning. She never noticed. That realization cut deeper than anything else. Friday evening arrived wrapped in routine. Dinner, small talk, familiar sounds. She laughed once, softly, at something I said, and for a brief moment I wondered if I had imagined everything. If this whole unraveling was just my mind breaking under years of silence and age. But then she checked the time, stood up, and reached for her coat with the same practiced ease. And just like that, doubt vanished. She left. The door closed. The house exhaled. I waited longer than usual before starting the recordings. I sat in the dark, letting the silence stretch until it felt unbearable. My heart beat slow and heavy, like it was preparing for something final. When I finally pressed play, I did it with the calm acceptance of a man who already knows the truth will hurt, but needs it anyway. The footage unfolded with brutal familiarity. The walk across the street. The neighbor's door opening without hesitation. The immediate shift in atmosphere. But this time, something was different. The voices were lower. The movements more careful. There was an edge to everything, as if they were aware, perhaps not of me, but of risk. I leaned closer. The room inside the neighbor's house came into clearer focus than ever before. I recognized furniture now, angles, corners. This wasn't just a place she visited. It was a space she knew intimately. The way she navigated it, without hesitation, without uncertainty, told me she had memorized every inch of it over years. Then I noticed the others. I felt something inside me crack, not loudly. Not all at once, but enough that I had to steady myself against the table. This wasn't secrecy born from shame. This was authority. At one point, the recording caught her standing alone near a wall covered in papers. I froze the frame, rewound, played it again. The papers weren't random. They were organized, labeled, timelines, connections, names written carefully, some crossed out, some circled, some marked with symbols I didn't recognize. And then I saw it. A name I knew too well. My breath left my body in a single, shallow gasp. I didn't want to keep watching after that. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to destroy the recordings, to confront her immediately. But I didn't. I stayed still. I watched. Because somewhere deep inside, I understood that this was the moment my life had been steering toward for 20 years. The footage continued. She gave instructions calmly, without emotion. Others responded with nods, brief murmurs of acknowledgement. No arguments. No hesitation. She wasn't participating, she was directing. Whatever this was, she wasn't just involved, she was in control. I felt old then. Not because of my body, but because of time itself. Because I realized how much of my life had passed, while something else had been unfolding right beside me. Every Friday night I had spent alone, thinking I was the stable one, the dependable one, the constant when in truth, I had been the background. The recordings lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, I was shaking, but the shaking wasn't panic anymore. It was clarity. I replayed specific moments again and again. Her tone, the way others reacted, the deliberate pace. This wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It was methodical, strategic, long-term. I began taking notes, times, patterns, who spoke when, who moved where. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the words blurred. The more I observed, the more a structure emerged. A hierarchy. A purpose. And slowly, horrifyingly, I understood that I wasn't just an outsider to this world. I was a variable in it. The realization didn't make me angry, that it made me careful. I stopped sleeping properly after that. Not because I was afraid of her, but because I was thinking, planning, watching her the way she had clearly been watching me for years. I matched her silence with my own. I mirrored her calm. I became invisible again, but this time by choice. Another Friday came, and this time, before she left, She looked at me for just a second longer than usual. It was nothing obvious. Just a pause. A look. But in that moment, I felt it unmistakably. She knew something had shifted. She didn't know what. Not yet. But she felt it. The door closed behind her. I didn't rush to the screen. I sat there, breathing slowly, my mind steady in a way it hadn't been since this began. Because I understood now that knowledge was power. And for the first time in 20 years, I was no longer blind. The recordings that night confirmed what I had begun to suspect. They were preparing for something. And whatever it was close, very close. I shut off the screen and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as dawn approached. I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear had done its job. It had woken me up. Now came patience. Because the truth, when it finally surfaced, would not just shatter my world. It would force me to decide whether I was willing to reclaim it. The weeks that followed were not marked by action, but by restraint. I learned quickly that patience was not simply waiting, it was discipline. Every morning I woke beside her as if nothing had changed. I drank my coffee. I read the paper. I listened to her speak about trivial things, groceries, weather, neighbors, as though her life did not fracture into an entirely different existence every Friday night. But now I knew, and knowing rewired everything. Stopped thinking of myself as a husband who had been betrayed. That framing was too small, too emotional. This was not about love or infidelity or secrecy in the way people usually understand it. This was about parallel lives running side by side for 20 years, one visible, one hidden, and the terrifying precision with which they had been kept apart. I reviewed every recording again, this time in sequence, building a timeline that stretched back years. Patterns emerged with disturbing clarity. The same faces appeared again and again. Some aged, some disappeared. Others replaced them. The neighbor's house was not a meeting place by accident. It was a hub, a control point, a place chosen because no one ever questioned it, including me. I began researching quietly. Names I overheard, addresses I recognized, public records, old articles, corporate filings, community board minutes, anything that could give context to the fragments I had captured. Slowly, a picture formed. And it was far more calculated than I had ever imagined. This was not a secret affair. It was an operation. The people in those recordings were not friends or accomplices in something petty. They were connected through layers of shared history, failed ventures, sudden disappearances, unexpected financial windfalls, legal cases that vanished before reaching court. And at the center of it all was my wife. Calm and composed, moving pieces across a board one hadn't known existed. What chilled me most was not what she was doing, but how long she had been doing it. 20 years. That meant this life of hers had begun before certain milestones I once thought were sacred. Before anniversaries. Before illnesses. Before losses we mourned together. Entire moments I had believed were shared experiences now felt contaminated by the possibility that she had already been planning something else. While standing beside me, I started to question memory itself. Had she ever really been present? Or had I simply been convenient? Another Friday came, and this time I didn't just watch. I listened more closely than ever before. The recording caught a phrase repeated more than once: a date. A near future date. It wasn't spoken dramatically. No one emphasized it. But everyone acknowledged it. That was when I understood. The endgame was approaching. Whatever she had been orchestrating for 2 decades was nearing completion. And I was running out of time to decide who I was in this story: a witness, a casualty, or an obstacle. I began preparing not to confront her, but to protect myself. I secured copies of everything, stored them in places she would never look. I arranged documents, legal contingencies, Instructions that would activate only if something happened to me. I did this quietly, methodically, without panic. Fear would have made me sloppy, and sloppiness would have been fatal. One night, unexpectedly, she didn't leave. Friday came and went, and she stayed home. She sat across from me, eyes steady, voice even. She asked me questions, not accusations, but probes. How was I sleeping? Had I noticed anything unusual lately? Did I feel well? Each question was a test. I answered them carefully, truthfully, but selectively. I watched her face for micro-expressions, for shifts in posture, for anything that would reveal what she suspected. But she was disciplined, controlled. If she knew I was aware, she didn't show it. That scared me more than any confrontation would have, because silence, I realized, was her preferred weapon. Days later, I discovered something else in the recordings, something I had missed before because I wasn't looking for it. References to me weren't casual. They weren't dismissive. They were evaluative. As if my role, my behavior, my predictability mattered to the outcome of whatever they were planning. I wasn't irrelevant. I was accounted for. That realization forced a reckoning. I could no longer remain passive. Doing nothing was no longer neutrality, it was compliance. And I refused to be managed without consent. So I made my decision. I stopped watching. Instead, I started acting. Subtly, carefully, I altered routines. Changed small habits. Introduced unpredictability into my behavior. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create noise in the pattern she expected. I let her see me forget things. Question things. Wander into places I normally wouldn't. I wanted her uncertain, and it worked. The next recording captured something I had never seen before. Tension. Raised voices. Disagreement. A plan delayed. My name spoken with irritation instead of indifference. Whatever stability I had represented in their structure was shifting, and they felt it. That was my leverage. I didn't need to expose her. I didn't need revenge. I needed balance. The final Friday arrived quietly. She prepared to leave, standing by the door, coat in hand. She looked at me for a long moment, longer than ever before. There was something different in her eyes this time. Not suspicion. Respect. As if she finally understood that I was no longer asleep. She left. I didn't follow. I didn't watch. Instead, I waited. Because the truth is this. When you finally see the full shape of the world someone has hidden from you, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to play the role they assigned you. By morning, everything would change. Not because I confronted her, but because I was ready. And for the first time in 20 years, whatever came next would not be on her terms alone.